Sometimes the worst thing about being alone is that nobody hears you when you cry for help. Sometimes the best thing about being alone is that when you do hear someone crying, you know it's your job to answer. Boone Carver lived deep in the Montana mountains, far from people and their troubles. But when he heard that train whistle screaming through the trees, something wasn't right. Then he saw the dog tied to the railroad tracks with thick rope, unable to move. The Green Valley Express was coming fast around the bend. The dog had given up fighting and just lay there waiting. Boone ran harder than he had in years, his boots hitting the rails as his heart pounded. He didn't know who did this cruel thing or why, but he could see in the dog's eyes that it had known pain before and was now waiting for kindness. Would one act of mercy change everything for both of them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The torn red bandana around the dog's neck fluttered in the mountain wind as Boone knelt beside the tracks, his weathered hands working quickly to untie the cruel knots. The rope had bit deep into the animal's fur, leaving angry red marks that spoke of hours of struggle before resignation had set in. The dog, a mixed breed with the noble bearing of a German shepherd and the gentle eyes of a golden retriever, watched Boone with a mixture of wariness and desperate hope. "Easy now, boy," Boone murmured, his voice rusty from months of speaking only to himself and the mountain creatures that shared his solitude. "Nobody's gonna hurt you anymore." The train's whistle had faded into the distance, carrying with it the Green Valley Express and its cargo of lumber bound for the mills down in Missoula. Boone had reached the dog with seconds to spare, scooping the trembling animal from the tracks just as the massive locomotive thundered past. Its wind whipping through the pines and sending a shower of autumn leaves spiraling through the crisp October air. Now, in the sudden quiet that followed the train's passage, Boone found himself face to face with a decision he'd been avoiding for nearly a decade. The dog needed help, medical attention, food and care that went beyond what his isolated mountain cabin could provide. That meant going back to town, back to people, back to the world he'd deliberately left behind. Boone Carver had chosen his exile carefully. His cabin sat on a remote plateau 8 miles up the old logging road, accessible only by foot or horseback once the snows came. He'd built it himself in those first angry months after leaving Pine Ridge, working from dawn to dusk with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The physical labor had been a kind of salvation then. Each swing of his axe and each notch he cut into the logs, helping to drown out the voices in his head, the accusations, the guilt, the endless replay of that terrible night when everything had gone wrong. The cabin was modest but well built, with thick log walls that kept out the mountain cold and a stone fireplace that had warmed many solitary evenings. Solar panels he'd installed 3 years back provided enough power for basic lighting and to run the small refrigerator where he kept his perishables. A hand-dug, well-supplied fresh water and the root cellar he'd carved into the hillside behind the cabin stored enough preserved food to last through the harshest winters. His days followed a rhythm as predictable as the seasons. Morning coffee on the porch, while the sun painted the distant peaks gold and pink. Checking his snares and fishing lines. Tending the small garden where he grew potatoes, carrots, and beans. Afternoons spent chopping wood, maintaining equipment, or reading from the modest library he'd accumulated over the years, mostly classics and histories. Books that spoke to fundamental truths about human nature and the passage of time. Evenings were for his journal, a leather-bound notebook where he recorded the weather, wildlife sightings, and occasionally his thoughts. The entries had grown shorter over the years, reduced mostly to factual observations. Saw a black bear with 2 cubs near the creek. First snow on the peaks. Fixed the leak in the cabin roof. The deeper reflections, the wrestling with memory and regret he'd learned to keep locked away, but now, cradling this injured animal in his arms, Boone felt those carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. The dog's trust, offered despite the cruelty it had endured, reminded him of something he'd almost forgotten, that mercy was a choice, And sometimes the most important choices came when you least expected them. The red bandana around the dog's neck was cheap cotton, the kind sold in any general store. But someone had tied it there deliberately, perhaps as identification, perhaps as some cruel mark of ownership. Boone carefully removed it, studying the faded fabric. No name, no markings, just a simple red cloth that had witnessed whatever hell this animal had endured before ending up on those tracks. "What's your story, boy?" Boone asked, gently running his hands over the dog's ribs. Too thin, but no obvious broken bones. The animal was dehydrated and exhausted, but alive. "Who did this to you and why?" The dog's response was to press closer against Boone's chest, seeking warmth and comfort. It was a gesture that hit Boone harder than he expected, a reminder of what it meant to trust another living being completely. When was the last time he'd felt that kind of connection? When was the last time anyone had looked at him without suspicion or disappointment? The answer came unbidden. Sarah Chen, the veterinarian who tried to convince him to stay when he'd announced his intention to leave Pine Ridge. She'd understood his guilt without judging it, had offered friendship without demanding explanations. But even her gentle persistence hadn't been enough to keep him from fleeing to these mountains, carrying his shame like a stone in his chest. Now he would have to see her again. The dog needed professional care, and Sarah was the only veterinarian within 50 miles. The thought of walking into her clinic, of facing her questions and her kindness, made his stomach clench with anxiety. But the alternative, letting this innocent animal suffer because of his own cowardice, was unthinkable. Boone stood carefully, the dog secure in his arms, and began the long walk back to his cabin. The afternoon sun slanted through the pines, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Somewhere in the distance a hawk cried, and the familiar sounds of the wilderness, the whisper of wind through branches, the distant chatter of squirrels, the soft crunch of pine needles under his boots, provided their usual comfort. But today, the comfort felt different, less complete. The dog's warm weight against his chest was a reminder that solitude, no matter how carefully chosen, was not the same as peace. True peace, he was beginning to remember, came from connection, from the willingness to risk hurt in service of something larger than yourself. Back at the cabin, Boone laid the dog on his own bed, covering the animal with his warmest blanket. He heated water on the wood stove and carefully cleaned the rope burns with gentle soap, speaking in low, reassuring tones throughout the process. The dog endured the treatment with patient dignity, never snapping or pulling away, even when the cleaning must have caused pain. "You're a good boy," Boone murmured, offering small sips of water from his cupped palm. "Whatever happened to you, whatever brought you to those tracks, it's over now. I promise you that." It was the first promise he'd made to another living being in 10 years, and the weight of it settled over him like a mantle. Promises had consequences. They required follow-through, commitment, the willingness to put someone else's needs before your own comfort. They were dangerous things, promises, especially for a man who'd already failed so spectacularly at keeping the ones that mattered most. As evening fell and the first stars appeared through the cabin windows, Boone sat beside the bed, watching the dog's steady breathing. The animal had finally relaxed into true sleep, one paw twitching occasionally as if chasing something in dreams that were hopefully kinder than recent reality. Tomorrow would bring the difficult journey to town, the confrontation with his past, and whatever consequences followed from choosing involvement over isolation. But tonight, in the quiet sanctuary of his cabin, Boone allowed himself to feel something he'd almost forgotten, the deep satisfaction that came from doing right by another living creature. No matter the cost to himself, the red bandana lay on his kitchen table, a tangible reminder of the cruelty that humans were capable of inflicting. But the sleeping dog was a reminder of something else, that cruelty didn't have to have the final word, that mercy could still triumph if someone was willing to act. Boone Carver had spent 10 years running from the world and its pain. Tomorrow he would take the first step back toward it, carrying nothing but an injured dog and the fragile hope that it wasn't too late to make a difference in at least one life. Outside, the mountain wind sang through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valleys, carrying its own stories of departure and destination, of journeys that sometimes led exactly where they needed to go. The morning light revealed the true extent of the dog's injuries, and Boone knew he could delay no longer. Dark bruises mottled the animal's ribs beneath the golden fur, and despite his gentle care through the night, the dog remained lethargic and barely responsive to offers of food and water. Every breath seemed to require effort, and Boone's inexperienced hands could only do so much. He found himself standing before an old wooden dresser he hadn't opened in years, his hand hovering over the bottom drawer. Inside, wrapped in faded tissue paper, lay a sheriff's badge, five-pointed star of tarnished silver that had once represented everything he believed about justice and protection. He'd carried that badge for 15 years before the night that changed everything, and he'd kept it hidden here like some shameful secret ever since. The badge felt heavier than he remembered as he lifted it from its resting place. Boone Carver, Sheriff, Pine Ridge County. The engraving was still clear despite the tarnish, a reminder of the man he'd once been before failure had driven him into these mountains like a wounded animal seeking darkness. "Not today," he whispered, wrapping the badge back in its tissue shroud and closing the drawer. Today, he was just a man with an injured dog, nothing more complicated than that. The journey down the mountain took 3 hours, with Boone carrying the dog, wrapped in blankets, and stopping frequently to rest. The animal had accepted the journey with quiet resignation, pressing close to Boone's chest and trusting in this stranger's care. By the time they reached the outskirts of Pine Ridge, Boone's arms ached and his shirt was soaked with sweat. But the dog was still breathing steadily. Pine Ridge looked smaller than he remembered, though 10 years of mountain solitude might have changed his perspective on many things. The main street still hosted the same collection of weathered storefronts, Murphy's General Store, the Copper Kettle Diner, and at the far end, the white clapboard building with its simple sign, Pine Ridge Veterinary Clinic, Dr. Sarah Chen. DVM. His boots felt unnaturally loud on the wooden sidewalk as he approached the clinic. Through the large front window, he could see the familiar waiting area with its mismatched chairs and walls covered in photos of grateful pet owners with their animals. A small bell chimed as he pushed through the door, and the antiseptic smell of the clinic brought back memories he'd tried to bury. "I'll be right with you," a voice called from the back room. Sarah's voice, unchanged after all these years. The sound of it made his chest tighten with emotions he couldn't name. She appeared in the doorway a moment later, wiping her hands on a towel, and stopped dead when she saw him. Dr. Sarah Chen had aged gracefully, her black hair now streaked with silver and pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore the same style of scrubs she'd favored 10 years ago, and her dark eyes held the same intelligence and compassion that had made her such a good friend when friendship was something he could still accept. "Boone," she said softly, and in that single word he heard surprise, concern, and something that might have been relief. "It's been a long time." "Too long," he admitted, suddenly aware of how he must look. Beard grown wild, clothes that smelled of wood smoke and mountain air, carrying a wounded animal like some kind of hermit from a folk tale. "This dog needs help. Found him tied to the railroad tracks yesterday." Sarah's expression shifted immediately to professional concern. "Bring him back here," she said, leading the way to an examination room. "What's his condition?" "Dehydrated, underfed, rope burns around his neck and legs. Been tied up for a while, I'd guess." Boone gently placed the dog on the examination table, his hands reluctant to break contact with the animal that had brought him back to this world. Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking the dog's vitals and examining the injuries. Her touch was gentle but thorough, and the dog seemed to sense her expertise. Remaining calm despite being in unfamiliar surroundings. "These rope burns are several days old," she murmured, carefully cleaning one of the wounds. "Poor thing's been through hell. Do you know who he belongs to?" "That's what I was hoping you could tell me. Somebody in town must be missing a dog like this. Sarah paused in her examination, studying the dog's face with a frown of recognition. Boone, I think this is Rex. He belongs to Martha Henley, lives out on Copper Creek Road. She reported him missing 3 days ago. The name Martha Henley stirred old memories. A widow who'd lost her husband in a logging accident, if Boone remembered correctly. She'd had a nephew who'd gotten into trouble more than once during Boone's tenure as sheriff. A young man named Jake who'd struggled with drinking and making poor choices even then. 3 days, Boone repeated. That's a long time for a dog to be missing. Martha's been worried sick. She's in her 70s now, and Rex is really all the family she has left. Well, except for her nephew Jake, but he's been... Sarah caught herself, remembering Boone's former profession. It's not my place to gossip. Jake Henley, Boone said. I remember him. Trouble seemed to follow that boy around. Sarah's expression grew troubled. It's gotten worse since you left. Gambling, drinking, and now people say he owes money to some very unpleasant individuals. Martha's tried to help him, but there's only so much a woman her age can do. A cold certainty settled in Boone's stomach. A beloved family dog doesn't just end up tied to railroad tracks by accident. Someone had put Rex there deliberately, and the most likely candidate was someone desperate enough to use an innocent animal as leverage or threat. Is Jake living with Martha? On and off. She's too kind-hearted to turn him away completely, even when he brings trouble to her door. Sarah finished her examination and began applying antibiotic ointment to Rex's wounds. This dog will be fine with proper care. He's tough, and the injuries look worse than they are. But Boone, she paused, meeting his eyes. If Jake did this, it means he's in deeper trouble than anyone realized. Martha could be in danger. There it was. The moment Boone had been dreading since he'd first seen Rex tied to those tracks. This wasn't just about rescuing one dog. It was about stepping back into the messy complexity of human problems. About getting involved in situations where good people got hurt, and sometimes there were no clean solutions. I need to talk to Martha, he said. She lives alone out on the old Henley place. Boone, be careful. Whatever Jake's gotten himself into, it's brought some dangerous people around. Sheriff Morrison's young and inexperienced, and frankly, this town could use someone who knows how to handle real trouble. The weight of expectation in her voice was almost too much to bear. She was asking him to be the man he'd once been, the sheriff who'd protected this community for 15 years. But that man had failed when it mattered most, had let a child die because he'd trusted the wrong person and moved too slowly when quick action might have made the difference. I'm not that man anymore. Sarah, maybe not, she said gently, scratching Rex behind the ears. But you're the man who risked his life to save this dog from a train. That's not the action of someone who's given up on doing what's right. Rex lifted his head at her touch, his tail managing a weak wag. The simple gesture seemed to speak volumes about resilience and the capacity for trust, even after betrayal. Can I take him to Martha? Let me give him some fluids and pain medication first. Then yes, he should be fine to travel. Boone, she hesitated, then continued. It's good to see you again. Whatever brought you down from that mountain, I'm glad it did. As Sarah prepared Rex for the journey, Boone stood at the clinic window, watching the afternoon life of Pine Ridge unfold on the street outside. Children walking home from school, shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, elderly residents gathering at the diner for coffee and conversation. It was a good community, the kind of place worth protecting. The question was whether he had the courage to try again, knowing that this time, as before, he might not be strong enough or quick enough or wise enough to save everyone who needed saving. The Henley place sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through stands of aspen and pine, their golden leaves rustling in the late afternoon breeze. Boone remembered the property from his sheriff days. A modest farmhouse with a red barn and pastures where cattle had once grazed. Now the fields lay fallow, and the barn showed signs of neglect, its paint peeling and one door hanging askew on rusted hinges. Rex had perked up considerably during the drive, recognizing familiar territory as Boone's old pickup truck navigated the winding road. The dog's tail began wagging in earnest when the house came into view, and he whined softly, Pressing his nose against the passenger window, Martha Henley emerged from the house before Boone had even shut off the engine. She moved with the careful steps of someone whose bones remembered younger days, but whose spirit remained strong. Her grey hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore a faded cotton dress covered by a hand-knitted sweater. When she saw Rex through the truck window, her weathered face lit up with joy and relief. "Rex!" she cried, hurrying toward the vehicle as fast as her arthritic knees would allow. "Oh, my dear boy, I thought I'd lost you forever." The reunion was everything Boone had hoped to see. Rex practically leaped from the truck into Martha's arms, his tail wagging so hard his entire body wiggled with excitement. Martha knelt in the gravel drive, heedless of the dirt on her dress, holding the dog close and murmuring endearments while tears streamed down her cheeks. "Thank you," she said, looking up at Boone with eyes that held a lifetime of gratitude. "I don't know who you are, but thank you for bringing him home. Name's Boone Carver, ma'am. I found Rex tied up on the railroad tracks yesterday. Dr. Chen checked him over. He's going to be fine." Martha's expression shifted from joy to confusion, then to a dawning horror. "The railroad tracks? But who would—" She stopped herself, and Boone saw the moment when understanding settled over her features like a dark cloud. "Jake," she whispered. "Ma'am, I think we need to talk." Martha nodded slowly, her hand never leaving Rex's head. "Come inside. I'll put coffee on." The farmhouse interior spoke of a life well lived but reduced by circumstance. The furniture was old but well maintained, and the walls held decades' worth of family photographs. Boone found himself studying a particular picture on the mantelpiece, a young man in military uniform standing beside a younger Martha, and a man who must have been her late husband. "That's Jake's father." "Michael?" Martha said, following his gaze as she set down 2 cups of coffee. "Lost him in Afghanistan when Jake was just 12. My husband died in a logging accident 2 years later. Jake came to live with me then." She settled into a worn armchair, Rex immediately positioning himself at her feet. The dog kept looking toward the door, and Boone noticed the way his ears pricked at every sound from outside. "He's waiting for Jake," Martha explained sadly. "Rex has always been devoted to that boy, even when Jake didn't deserve it. Dogs love unconditionally, don't they? Sometimes I think that's both a blessing and a curse." Boone pulled a faded family photograph from his jacket pocket, the one he'd found tucked behind Rex's collar, showing Jake as a young boy with his parents. Martha's eyes filled with fresh tears when she saw it. "Where did you find this?" "It was with Rex, hidden behind his collar, like someone wanted to make sure it stayed with him." Boone handed her the photograph carefully. "Mrs. Henley, I need to ask you some difficult questions about Jake." Martha nodded, her fingers tracing the edges of the photograph. "I know what you're thinking, and you're probably right. Jake's been in trouble again. Bad trouble this time. When did you last see him?" 4 days ago. He came here asking for money. Said he needed $5,000 or something terrible would happen. I told him I didn't have that kind of money. The farm barely breaks even, and my Social Security only goes so far." Her voice broke slightly. "He got angry, started yelling about how I never supported him, how everyone in his life had let him down. Then he stormed out, and I haven't seen him since." "Did he say who he owed money to?" Martha's hands trembled as she lifted her coffee cup. "A man named Vince something. Jake said he was from out of state, that he'd come to Pine Ridge specifically to collect what Jake owed him. The way Jake talked about him," she shuddered. "I could tell he was frightened. Really frightened." Boone felt pieces of an ugly puzzle clicking into place. A desperate young man, violent creditors, and an elderly woman living alone with only a loyal dog for protection. Jake had probably taken Rex as some kind of bargaining chip or threat, but desperation had driven him to consider something even more horrible. "Mrs. Henley, I think Jake intended to hurt himself along with Rex. The way the dog was tied to those tracks, it wasn't just cruelty. It was meant to look like an accident, but take out everything Jake thought was holding him back from just disappearing entirely." Martha's face went pale. "You mean suicide?" "I think he was planning to make it look like he tried to save Rex, but couldn't manage it in time. 1 train, 2 casualties, no more debts, and no more disappointing the people who cared about him." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an old clock on the mantel and Rex's gentle breathing. Martha stared at the photograph in her hands, and Boone could see her replaying recent conversations with Jake. Looking for signs she might have missed. I should have given him the money, she said finally. Should have mortgaged the farm, done whatever it took. That wouldn't have solved anything, ma'am. Men like this, Vince, don't stop at one payment. They'd have bled you dry and still wanted more. Then what do I do now? Jake's still out there somewhere, still in trouble, and now he's done something that could land him in prison. If he's even still alive, it was the question Boone had been dreading, because he knew there was only one answer that made sense. Jake was somewhere in Pine Ridge, or the surrounding area, probably hiding from both his creditors and the consequences of what he'd almost done. He was desperate, probably armed, and making increasingly poor decisions. The local sheriff was young and inexperienced, as Sarah had mentioned. The state police were hours away and wouldn't treat this as a priority unless someone died. That left Boone, a man who'd spent 10 years hiding from exactly this kind of responsibility. I'll find him, he heard himself say, the words emerging before his rational mind could stop them. I'll find Jake and try to help him figure a way out of this mess. Martha looked up at him with something approaching hope. You'd do that? For people you barely know? Boone reached over to scratch Rex behind the ears, remembering the trust in the dog's eyes when he'd lifted him from those railroad tracks. Sometimes that's when it matters most, ma'am. When there's no history to complicate things, no old grievances to get in the way. Just one person choosing to help another because it's the right thing to do. Rex's tail thumped against the floor, and for a moment, Boone allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this time he might be strong enough to save everyone who needed saving. The search for Jake began at Murphy's General Store, where Boone figured the owner might have seen or heard something useful. Tom Murphy had run the store for 40 years and had a reputation for knowing everyone's business, usually before they knew it themselves. The bell above the door chimed as Boone entered, bringing with it the familiar smells of coffee, leather goods, and the penny candy that had drawn local children for generations. Tom looked up from his inventory clipboard, his weathered face breaking into a surprised smile. Well, I'll be damned. Boone Carver back from the dead. Tom set down his clipboard and extended a calloused hand. Heard you were living up in the mountains like some kind of hermit. Something like that. Boone shook the offered hand, noting how Tom's grip had weakened over the years. I'm looking for Jake Henley. Seen him around lately? Tom's expression grew cautious. Jake's been making himself scarce the past few days. Last time I saw him was maybe a week ago, coming in to buy cigarettes and looking like he hadn't slept in a month. Paid with crumpled bills, kept checking over his shoulder like he expected trouble to walk through that door any minute. He say anything about who he was worried about? Not to me directly, but I overheard him on his phone outside. Something about needing more time, promising he'd have the money soon. Whoever he was talking to didn't sound sympathetic. Tom leaned closer, lowering his voice. Boone, there's been strangers in town asking questions about Jake, not the kind of men you want to meet in a dark alley. If you catch my meaning. Boone felt his instincts sharpening, the old sheriff's awareness returning like muscle memory. What kind of questions? Where he lives, what kind of vehicle he drives, who his family is. I didn't tell them nothing, but other folks might not be so careful. These aren't the type to give up easy. When was this? 2 days ago. They were driving a black SUV with out-of-state plates. I made note of it because we don't get many vehicles like that around here. Tom rummaged through papers behind the counter and pulled out a receipt with writing on the back. I wrote down the license number just in case. Boone studied the number, memorizing it. Professional paranoia was another old habit that died hard. They say where they were staying? Nope, but Billy Henderson saw them at the Pine Ridge Motel yesterday evening. Billy was delivering supplies there and said they had at least 3 rooms rented. 3 rooms meant multiple men, probably armed and definitely serious about collecting whatever Jake owed them. Boone thanked Tom and headed for his next stop, the Pine Ridge Tavern, where Jake had been known to spend considerable time and money in years past. The tavern occupied a converted warehouse on the edge of town, its neon sign flickering even in daylight. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of fried food. A handful of locals nursed beers at the bar, while a lone figure played pool in the back corner. Boone recognized the bartender, Eddie Vasquez, who'd tended bar here since before Boone became sheriff. Eddie's face showed no surprise at seeing him, as if customers routinely returned from decade-long absences. "Beer?" Eddie asked, already reaching for a glass. "Information," Boone replied. "About Jake Henley." Eddie's hand paused. "Jake's not welcome here anymore. Hasn't been for 3 weeks now." "What happened?" "Got into a fight with some guy over a poker game." "Not just any fight," Jake pulled a knife. "I had to ban him before somebody got seriously hurt." Eddie set down the glass and leaned on the bar. "Between you and me, Jake's been spiraling for months. Started with the gambling, then moved on to harder stuff. Word is he owes serious money to some very dangerous people. You know anything about his truck?" "Someone said he abandoned it near the railroad tracks." Eddie nodded grimly. "Found it 2 days ago when I was driving home late. Driver's door was standing open, keys still in the ignition. Interior was torn apart, like someone had searched it real thorough-like." Boone felt another piece click into place. Someone had gotten to Jake's truck before Jake had the chance to use it as an escape vehicle. That meant his creditors were closer than anyone realized, and Jake was running out of options and hiding places. Any idea where he might hole up if he was desperate? "There's the old mining cabin up on Whiskey Creek. Jake used to go there when he was younger, said it was a good place to think. His uncle used to take him hunting up there before the accident." Eddie pulled a crumpled IOU note from the cash register and slid it across the bar. "Found this in his truck. Figured it might be important to somebody." The note was written in Jake's handwriting, promising to pay Vincent Torino $15,000 or else face the consequences. It was signed and dated just 1 week ago. The amount made Boone's stomach drop. 15,000 was far more than Martha had mentioned, and far more than a young man with Jake's limited income could ever hope to repay. "Eddie, this says 15,000. I heard it was 5. "Interest," Eddie said darkly. "These loan sharks, they got ways of making debts grow real fast. Miss a payment, the amount doubles. Miss another, it doubles again. Jake probably borrowed 5,000 and watched it turn into 15 when he couldn't pay on time. The mathematics of desperation were becoming clear. Jake had borrowed money he couldn't repay, watched the debt grow beyond any hope of resolution, and finally reached the point where death seemed like the only way out. Taking Rex with him had probably been his way of ensuring Martha wouldn't have to face these men alone when they came looking for their money. Boone pocketed the IOU and headed for the door. "If Jake shows up here, call the sheriff. Don't try to handle it yourself. What about you? You planning to go looking for him up at Whiskey Creek?" The question hung in the smoky air like a challenge. Boone knew that heading up to that isolated cabin could be walking into a trap, either one set by Jake in his desperation or by the men hunting him. But the alternative was leaving a troubled young man to face his demons alone, and Martha to wonder forever what had happened to the boy she'd raised as her own son. "Yeah," Boone said. "I am." Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere up in those hills, Jake Henley was making decisions that would determine whether he lived to see another sunset. Boone climbed into his truck and pointed it toward Whiskey Creek, carrying with him the weight of promises made and the hope that this time he might be fast enough and smart enough to save a life that hung in the balance. The road to Whiskey Creek was little more than a pair of tire ruts winding through dense forest, becoming increasingly treacherous as Boone's truck climbed higher into the mountains. Ancient pines pressed close on both sides, their branches scraping against the vehicle's roof and creating a tunnel of green shadows. The familiar weight of his service revolver, retrieved from its hiding place in the cabin before starting this journey, pressed against his ribs beneath his jacket. 20 minutes up the winding trail, Boone spotted something that made him pull over and kill the engine. Fresh tire tracks in the mud, too wide to belong to Jake's compact truck. Someone else had been up this road recently, and given the circumstances, Boone doubted they were here for the fishing. he continued on foot, moving with the careful silence his military training had ingrained decades ago. The sound of running water grew louder as he approached Whiskey Creek, and through the trees he could make out the weathered grey boards of the old mining cabin that Eddie had mentioned. The structure looked like it might collapse in the next strong wind, walls sagging, roof patched with rusty metal sheets, and one corner supported by a makeshift brace of lodgepole pine. But there were recent signs of habitation, a thin wisp of smoke from the stone chimney, and Jake's battered Honda Civic parked behind the cabin, almost hidden beneath a covering of pine branches. Boone circled the cabin at a distance, using the forest for cover while he assessed the situation. Through a grimy window, he could see Jake moving around inside, his movements jerky and agitated. The young man looked like he'd aged years in the past few days, unshaven, clothes wrinkled and stained, the kind of hollow-eyed exhaustion that came from fear and sleepless nights. As Boone watched, Jake sat down at a rough wooden table and pulled something from his jacket pocket. Even from a distance, Boone could see the metallic glint of his father's military compass, a brass instrument that had guided Michael Henley through 2 tours overseas before coming home to Pine Ridge and starting a family. The sight of Jake holding that compass struck Boone with unexpected emotion. He remembered Michael Henley, a quiet man who'd served his country with honor and then worked hard to build a good life for his family. The compass had been passed down from Michael's own father, a symbol of finding your way home, no matter how far you'd traveled or how lost you'd become. Now, Jake was turning it over in his hands like a prayer bead, seeking guidance that the instrument couldn't provide. The young man's shoulders shook, and Boone realized with a start that Jake was crying, deep, silent sobs that spoke of despair beyond words. Boone made his decision and stepped out of the tree line, approaching the cabin with his hands visible and moving slowly. Jake's head snapped up at the sound of footsteps on the wooden porch, and suddenly there was a pistol in his hands, an old revolver that had probably belonged to his uncle. "Stay back," Jake shouted, his voice cracking with strain. "I don't want to hurt anybody, but I will if I have to." "Easy, son," Boone said, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "I'm not here to hurt you. Name's Boone Carver. I found Rex tied to those railroad tracks." The mention of Rex caused Jake's composure to crumble completely. The gun wavered in his grip as fresh tears streamed down his face. Did he? Rex is fine. He's home with Martha, safe and sound." Jake's relief was so profound that he nearly dropped the weapon. "Thank God. When I heard that train whistle, I knew I couldn't go through with it. I ran back to the tracks, but you were already there. I watched you carry him away. Why don't you put that gun down, and we can talk about this properly?" Jake's laugh was bitter and humorless. "Talk about what?" "How I'm a complete failure. How I managed to disappoint everyone who ever cared about me. How I almost killed the only innocent thing in this whole mess. You could start by telling me about Vincent Torino and how you got mixed up with him." At the mention of Torino's name, Jake's grip tightened on the pistol again. "How do you know about Vince?" "Found your IOU note. 15,000 is a lot of money, Jake. How did it get that high?" Jake sank into a chair on the porch, the gun now pointed at the floor, but still in his hands. "Started with 5,000. I was trying to win back money I'd lost in a poker game. Thought I could get ahead for once, maybe help Aunt Martha fix up the farm. But Vince's games are rigged. You can't win, only lose more. So the debt kept growing. Every week I couldn't pay, it doubled. 5 became 10, 10 became 20. But Vince said he'd settle for 15 if I could get it to him by last Monday. When I couldn't," Jake's voice broke again. "He said he'd take it out of Aunt Martha instead. Said an old woman living alone on a remote farm might have an accident that looked natural. The threat against Martha explained everything. Jake's desperation, his willingness to consider suicide, even his cruel plan involving Rex. In his twisted logic, if both he and the dog died in what appeared to be a tragic accident, Martha would be left alone, but safe. Torino would have no reason to pursue a grieving elderly woman who had just lost her beloved nephew and pet. Where is Torino now? He's got men watching the roads. They found my truck yesterday and tore it apart, looking for money or anything valuable. They've been hiding up here, but I know they'll find me eventually. These aren't the kind of people who give up." Boone studied the young man's face, seeing echoes of Michael Henley in the shape of his jaw and the determined set of his shoulders despite his fear. "Jake, your father's compass, did you pawn it?" Jake looked down at the brass instrument in his free hand. 3 weeks ago. But I went back yesterday and bought it from Pete Kowalski for everything I had left. Figured if I was going to die, I should at least have something of Dad's with me." The simple statement carried such profound sadness that Boone felt his throat tighten. This wasn't a hardened criminal or a hopeless case. This was a lost young man who'd made increasingly desperate choices while trying to protect the only family he had left. Your father carried that compass through 2 wars and brought it home safely. You think he'd want you to give up now when there might still be another way out of this? What other way? I don't have $15,000. I don't have $5. And Vince isn't the kind of man who accepts apologies and promises. Boone climbed the porch steps slowly, noting how Jake's grip on the pistol remained loose. The young man was past the point of violence. He just wanted the pain to stop. Maybe Vince isn't the kind of man who accepts apologies, Boone said quietly. But I've dealt with men like him before. Sometimes there are other forms of persuasion that work better than money. For the first time since Boone had found him, Jake's eyes held something that might have been hope. Inside the cabin, Jake pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his jacket pocket with shaking hands. The handwriting was his own, but the words seemed to belong to a stranger, a man so far gone that death appeared to be the only remaining option. "I wrote this 3 days ago," Jake said, smoothing the paper on the rough wooden table. "Right after Vince's men came to see Aunt Martha." Boone read the suicide note in silence, his heart growing heavier with each line. It was addressed to Martha, asking her forgiveness for all the pain he'd caused, and explaining that his death would finally free her from the burden of his mistakes. The letter went on to detail how he planned to die, trying to save Rex from the railroad tracks, hoping his sacrifice would be remembered as something noble rather than the desperate act of a coward. "They went to Martha's house?" Boone asked, his voice carefully controlled. "2 of them. Big men in expensive suits who looked completely out of place in Pine Ridge. They told her they were friends of mine, said they were worried about me because I'd missed some appointments. But Aunt Martha's no fool. She could see the threat in their eyes." Jake stood and walked to the grimy window, staring out at the forest, as if he could see his enemies moving through the trees. "After they left, she called me in a panic. Said she'd never been so frightened in her life, not even when Uncle Robert died in that logging accident. That's when I knew Vince wasn't bluffing about hurting her. So you came up with the railroad plan. It seemed like the only way. If I died in an apparent accident while trying to save Rex, Aunt Martha would just be a grieving old woman. No reason for Vince to bother her anymore." Jake's voice grew thick with self-loathing. "But I couldn't go through with it. When that train whistle screamed through the trees, and I saw Rex lying there so trusting, so innocent, I realized I was about to murder the only thing in this world that loved me unconditionally." Boone folded the suicide note carefully and handed it back to Jake. "What happened to the Jake who used to help his aunt with the farm chores? The kid who made honor roll in high school despite losing both his father figures? That Jake died when he realized he was never going to be good enough to fill the holes they left behind." Jake returned to his chair, the brass compass turning over and over in his hands. "Do you know what it's like to look at a woman who sacrificed everything to raise you and know that you're nothing but a disappointment to her? Every choice I made, every mistake, every failure, it was like I was betraying their memory all over again." The pain in Jake's voice was so raw that Boone had to look away. He recognized that particular brand of guilt, the crushing weight of feeling responsible for letting down people who had believed in you. It was the same feeling that had driven him into these mountains 10 years ago. "Jake, what do you think your father would say if he could see you now?" "He'd say I was a disgrace, that I dishonored his memory and his name." "No," Boone said firmly. "He'd say you were his son who made some bad choices, but still had time to make better ones. He'd say that courage isn't about never falling down, it's about getting back up when you do." Jake's laugh was bitter. Easy words from someone who doesn't owe $15,000 to a man who breaks people's bones for entertainment. You're right. I don't owe Torino money, but I know something about guilt and running away from problems that seem too big to solve. Boone sat across from Jake at the rough table. 10 years ago, I was the sheriff of this county. A little girl died because I trusted the wrong person and moved too slowly when quick action might have saved her life. Jake looked up, surprise replacing some of the despair in his eyes. You were Sheriff Carver? I remember you. You came to Dad's funeral, told me that he was a hero and that heroes' sons had a responsibility to honor that sacrifice. I remember that day too. You were 12 years old and trying so hard to be brave for your Aunt Martha. You shook my hand and promised you'd take care of her. A lot of good that promise turned out to be. The promise still stands. Jake, you're still Michael Henley's son, and you still have the chance to honor his memory. But not by dying on railroad tracks or hiding in abandoned cabins. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his father's compass. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know how to fix this. The debt is real, Vince is real, and the threat to Aunt Martha is real. Even if I could somehow come up with $15,000, what's to stop him from demanding more? Nothing, Boone admitted. Men like Torino don't stop at one payment. They'll bleed you and your family dry, then find new ways to squeeze more out of you. That's why paying him isn't the answer. Then what is? Boone leaned back in his chair, his mind working through possibilities and scenarios. In his sheriff days, he dealt with loan sharks and organized crime figures who preyed on small communities. They were dangerous, but they weren't invincible. They had weaknesses, ego, greed, and most importantly, a need to maintain their reputation for collecting debts. Torino's in Pine Ridge with a small crew, operating outside his normal territory. That makes him vulnerable in ways he might not realize. Small towns have advantages that big cities don't. Everyone knows everyone else's business. Strangers stand out, and people protect their own when threatened. You're talking about fighting back. I'm talking about not letting him terrorize innocent people. Your Aunt Martha has lived in Pine Ridge her entire life. She's helped her neighbors through hard times, volunteered at the church, been part of this community's fabric for decades. Do you really think the people of this town will stand by and watch some outside thug threaten her? Jake's grip on the compass tightened. But what if people get hurt? What if fighting back just makes things worse? What if it makes things better? What if standing up to bullies is exactly what this situation needs? For the first time in days, Jake's posture straightened slightly. The defeated slump in his shoulders gave way to something that might have been the beginning of resolve. If we did this, if we actually tried to stop Vince instead of just running or hiding, what would that look like? Boone smiled grimly. It would look like Michael Henley's son, remembering that heroes don't abandon the people they love. It would look like Pine Ridge, standing together against outside threats, the way small communities have always done when pushed too far. Jake stood and walked to the window again, but this time his gaze held determination rather than despair. All right, he said quietly. Tell me what we need to do. The sound of engines echoing through the forest cut their conversation short. Jake's face went white as he peered through the cabin window, watching 3 black SUVs wind their way up the narrow trail. They found me, he whispered. Boone moved to the back window, assessing their options. The creek behind the cabin offered some cover, but not enough to hide 2 men from a determined search party. How many rounds you got in that pistol? 6. Against how many men? Vince usually travels with 4 or 5 guys. All armed, all experienced. Jake's hands shook as he checked his father's revolver. We can't fight our way out of this. The lead SUV pulled up in front of the cabin, its engine ticking as it cooled. Boone watched a man step out, tall, expensively dressed despite the remote location, with the kind of predatory confidence that came from years of intimidating people for a living. Vincent Torino looked exactly like what he was, a professional collector of debts that couldn't be repaid. Jake Henley, Torino called out, his voice carrying easily through the thin cabin walls. I know you're in there, son. Time to settle up. What do we do? Jake whispered. Boone made a decision that surprised even himself. We go out there and face him. Are you insane? They'll kill us both. Maybe, or maybe Torino's about to learn something that changes everything. Boone moved toward the front door, his hand resting on the concealed service weapon beneath his jacket. Stay behind me, and whatever happens, don't shoot unless I tell you to. They stepped onto the cabin's sagging porch together. Jake's pistol held low but visible, Boone's hands empty but ready. Torino smiled when he saw them, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. There's the missing debtor. Jake, you've led us on quite a chase through these lovely mountains. Torino's voice carried a slight accent, probably New Jersey or New York. And you've brought a friend. How thoughtful, Mr. Torino, Jake said, his voice steadier than Boone had expected. I don't have your money. I know you don't, son. That's why we're here to discuss alternative arrangements. Torino gestured to his men, who had positioned themselves strategically around the clearing. Your Aunt Martha has a nice little farm, not worth 15,000, but it's a start. Leave her out of this. I'm afraid that's not how this works. See, when someone borrows money from me and then disappears, it sends a message to other potential clients. It suggests that Vincent Torino's debts are optional, negotiable. That's very bad for business. Boone stepped forward slightly, drawing Torino's attention. You're a long way from home, Vince. Torino's eyes narrowed as he studied Boone more carefully. Something in the older man's bearing seemed to trigger recognition, not of his face, but of his type. And you are. Someone who used to deal with men like you professionally. Used to. Used to. Boone let the silence stretch, watching Torino's expression change as he processed the implications. But some habits die hard. One of Torino's men whispered something urgent in his boss's ear, showing him what looked like a photograph on his phone. Torino's confident smile faltered as he studied the image, his face going pale despite his tan. Boone Carver, Torino said slowly. Former sheriff of Pine Ridge County. 15 years in law enforcement, 5 years military before that. Specialized in organized crime investigations. He paused, his voice taking on a different tone entirely. Also known as the cop who brought down the Marconi family's money laundering operation in 1998. The words hit Boone like a physical blow. The Marconi case, his greatest success and ultimately his greatest failure. He'd spent 3 years building an airtight case against one of the region's most powerful crime families, gathering evidence that would have put away dozens of people for decades. But on the night before the arrests were scheduled to begin, everything had gone wrong. You remember that case, don't you, Sheriff? Torino continued, his confidence returning as he saw the pain in Boone's eyes. The 8-year-old girl who died because someone tipped off the Marconis. What was her name? Sarah, Susan, Samantha, Boone said quietly. Samantha Chen, Dr. Sarah Chen's daughter. The child who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time when the Marconis decided to send a message about what happened to people who cooperated with law enforcement. Boone had promised Sarah that her family would be protected, that testifying against the money laundering operation would be safe. Instead, his informant had betrayed them all, and little Samantha had paid the price. That's right, Samantha. Tragic case. I heard you never got over it, that you blamed yourself for trusting the wrong person. Is that why you ran away to live in the mountains like a hermit? Jake looked between the two men, confusion and growing alarm evident on his face. He was witnessing something he didn't understand, a confrontation between two men whose histories were more complicated than they appeared. Here's what's interesting, Torino continued, pulling a thick manila folder from his jacket. I do my research on anyone who might interfere with my business. And according to this police file, Boone Carver has a very specific weakness. He can't stand to see innocent people get hurt because of his actions. Boone felt the familiar weight of guilt settling over him like a familiar coat. The file in Torino's hands contained everything: crime scene photos, witness statements, internal affairs reports that detailed his breakdown after Samantha's death. It was all there, the complete record of his failure to protect a child who had trusted him. So here's my offer, Torino said, his voice taking on a reasonable tone that made his words even more chilling. You walk away right now, go back to your mountain cabin, and pretend this conversation never happened. In exchange, I'll make Jake's death quick and relatively painless. No torture, no extended suffering, just a clean business transaction. And if I don't walk away, then I make sure everyone in Pine Ridge knows exactly what happened to the last little girl you tried to protect. I make sure they understand that Boone Carver's protection is worse than no protection at all. And then, after I've destroyed what's left of your reputation, I kill Jake anyway, slowly, creatively, and in a way that ensures his Aunt Martha finds the body. The folder fell open in Torino's hands, revealing crime scene photographs that Boone had tried for 10 years to forget. Samantha Chen's small body lying in the warehouse where the Marconis had left her as a warning. The little girl who had called him Uncle Boone and trusted him to keep her safe. Jake must have seen something in Boone's face because his grip tightened on his father's pistol. Don't listen to him. Whatever happened before, this is different, is it? Torino laughed. Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly the same. An aging lawman trying to play hero, about to get another innocent person killed because he can't accept his limitations. Boone stared at the photographs for a long moment, feeling the weight of 10 years' worth of guilt and self-recrimination. Torino was right about one thing. He had failed before, catastrophically and with devastating consequences. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to walk away and let Jake face whatever consequences awaited him. But as he looked at Jake standing beside him, young and frightened, but still willing to fight for his family, Boone realized something that surprised him. The fear that had driven him into exile wasn't fear of failing again. It was fear of never trying again, of letting his past mistakes paralyze him into permanent inaction. You're right about one thing, Vince, Boone said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. I did fail to protect Samantha Chen. I trusted the wrong person, and a little girl died because of it. Torino smiled triumphantly, already turning toward his vehicle. But that failure taught me something important, Boone continued. It taught me the difference between men who threaten children and men who protect them. And it taught me that some things are worth fighting for, even when you're not sure you can win. Torino stopped walking, his expression shifting to something closer to concern. What are you saying, Sheriff? I'm saying that Jake Henley is under my protection now. And I'm saying that if you want to hurt him or his family, you're going to have to go through me first. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind through the pines and the distant cry of a hawk. Torino's men shifted nervously, hands moving closer to concealed weapons. Jake stood straighter, his father's compass clutched in his free hand like a talisman. You're making a mistake, Torino said finally. Maybe, Boone replied. But it's my mistake to make. The standoff lasted 30 seconds before Torino made his choice. You want to play hero again, Sheriff? Fine. But this time when someone dies because of your arrogance, it's going to be you. He gestured to his men. We'll be in touch about collection arrangements. The black SUVs disappeared down the mountain trail in a cloud of dust and exhaust, but Boone knew this was far from over. Torino was a professional. He'd retreat, regroup, and return with a plan that accounted for Boone's involvement. The reprieve gave them maybe 6 hours to prepare for what was coming. We need to get you somewhere safe, Boone told Jake as they gathered their belongings from the cabin. What about Aunt Martha? If they can't get to me, they'll go after her. Boone had already considered that possibility. We're going to make sure she's protected too. But first, I need to ask you something important. That emergency medical kit in the cabin, is it well stocked? Jake looked puzzled by the question. Yeah, Aunt Martha made sure I brought plenty of supplies when I came up here. Why? Because we're about to ask people to put themselves in danger for us. The least we can do is be prepared to patch them up if things go wrong. Boone shouldered the comprehensive first aid kit, its weight a familiar comfort from his law enforcement days. Jake, I'm going to tell you some things that might be hard to hear. As they hiked back toward Boone's truck, he explained what he'd learned about men like Torino during his years as sheriff. They operated on reputation and fear, but they were also businessmen who calculated risk versus reward. A prolonged fight in a small town where everyone knew each other was exactly the kind of attention they usually avoided. The problem is, Torino can't back down now without losing face. He's committed to collecting this debt, which means he's going to escalate until someone stops him permanently. You're talking about killing him. I'm talking about ending this situation before more innocent people get hurt. Sometimes that means killing. Sometimes it means finding leverage to force a retreat. The key is being ready for either outcome. They reached the truck as afternoon shadows began lengthening across the forest floor. Boone's mind was already working through tactical considerations, sightlines, cover positions, escape routes. The old instincts were flooding back, bringing with them both confidence and concern. He'd been good at this work once, but 10 years of isolation had dulled his edge. The drive back to town gave them time to develop a strategy. First priority was getting Martha to safety, which meant convincing her to leave the farm temporarily. Second was gathering intelligence on Torino's operation. How many men, what kind of weapons, where they were staying. Third was deciding where to make their stand. The Pine Ridge Motel is where Tom Murphy saw them, Jake said. It's isolated on the edge of town near the railroad tracks. If we're going to confront them, that might be the best place, or it might be exactly where they want us to come. Men like Torino don't choose their locations randomly. Boone considered the tactical implications. What about your aunt's farm? How defensible is it? The house sits on high ground, with good sight lines in all directions. Uncle Robert built it that way on purpose, said a man should be able to see trouble coming from a long way off. There's only one road in, and the nearest neighbor is 2 miles away. It was both an advantage and a disadvantage. The isolation would prevent civilian casualties, but it also meant no immediate backup if things went wrong. Still, Boone was beginning to form a plan that might work. They found Martha in her kitchen, preparing dinner as if this were any ordinary evening. Rex lay at her feet, his ears perked and alert despite his recent ordeal. The dog's recovery had been remarkable, but Boone noticed how he kept glancing toward the windows, as if sensing that danger hadn't passed. "Mrs. Henley," Boone began carefully, "I need you to pack a bag and come stay in town for a few days." Martha looked up from the potatoes she was peeling, her expression calm but resolute. "This is about those men who came here asking about Jake, isn't it?" "Yes, ma'am." "They're dangerous people, and then this is where I need to be." Martha set down her paring knife and fixed Boone with a steady gaze. "I've lived on this farm for 43 years. I buried my husband in the cemetery just down the road, and I've weathered every kind of storm these mountains can throw at a person. I'm not about to be driven from my home by some city thugs who think they can intimidate an old woman." Jake started to protest, but Martha held up her hand. "Jacob Michael Henley, you listen to me. Your father and uncle didn't raise you to run from fights, and they didn't raise me to abandon family when things get difficult. We're going to face this together, right here where we belong." Boone found himself admiring the steel in the elderly woman's voice. Martha Henley had survived decades of mountain winters, the death of 2 husbands, and the challenge of raising a troubled nephew. She wasn't about to be intimidated by Vincent Torino and his hired muscle. "All right," he said finally. "But if we're making our stand here, we need to do it smart. Jake, show me every entrance to this property, every place someone could approach without being seen." The next 2 hours were spent in careful reconnaissance. The Henley farm was better positioned than Boone had hoped. The house sat on a small hill with clear fields of fire in 3 directions, and the 4th side was protected by a steep creek bank that would be difficult to cross quietly. The barn provided good cover for defenders, and the root cellar could serve as a refuge if retreat became necessary. "We'll need help," Boone concluded as they finished their survey. 3 people can't hold this position against 5 or 6 armed men, not for long. "I could call some of the neighbors," Martha suggested. "Robert Kowalski from the pawn shop used to be a Marine. Tom Murphy keeps a shotgun behind his counter for protection. There are good people in this community who won't stand by and watch outsiders threaten their neighbors." It was exactly what Boone had hoped to hear. Small-town solidarity was one of the few advantages they had against Torino's professional operation. But asking civilians to risk their lives was a decision that weighed heavily on his conscience. "Mrs. Henley, if we do this, if we ask your neighbors to help, some of them might get hurt. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" Martha's answer came without hesitation. "Sheriff Carver, are you prepared for the responsibility of what happens if we don't fight back? Vincent Torino isn't going to stop with Jake's debt. Men like him see weakness and exploit it. If we don't stand up to him now, he'll be back next month threatening someone else's family." She was right, and Boone knew it. Predators like Torino tested communities to find their breaking points. If Pine Ridge showed weakness now, it would become a target for every two-bit criminal looking for an easy score. As evening fell, the calls went out to trusted neighbors and friends. One by one, they arrived at the Henley farm. Robert Kowalski with his hunting rifle and steady hands, Tom Murphy carrying a pump-action shotgun, Eddie Vasquez from the tavern with a pistol and knowledge of the local terrain. Dr. Sarah Chen came too, bringing her medical bag and a quiet determination that reminded Boone why he'd valued her friendship so deeply. "For Samantha," she said simply when she saw the surprise in his eyes, "and for everyone else who deserves to be protected." The group gathered in Martha's living room, an unlikely militia of ordinary people who'd decided that some things were worth fighting for. Boone looked around the room and felt something he hadn't experienced in 10 years, the weight of command and the responsibility that came with it. "Before we go any further," he said, "I want everyone to understand what we're up against. Vincent Torino and his men are professionals. They're armed, they're experienced, and they're not going to hesitate to use violence. If anyone wants to leave now, there's no shame in it. Nobody moved. All right then. Let's talk about how we're going to send these bastards packing." Outside, storm clouds gathered over the mountains, and in the distance, the lonesome whistle of a freight train echoed across the valleys. Rex lifted his head at the sound, but this time there was no fear in his eyes. Only the alert attention of a dog who knew his family was in danger and was ready to help protect them. The plan they developed was simple but comprehensive. Overlapping fields of fire, predetermined fallback positions, and clear communication protocols. Most importantly, they would give Torino one final chance to leave peacefully before the shooting started. "He won't take it," Robert Kowalski observed. "Men like him don't back down from farmers and shopkeepers." "Then he's about to learn something about farmers and shopkeepers," Martha said, checking the loads in her late husband's hunting rifle. "We might not be professionals, but this is our home. That counts for something." As midnight approached and the first fat raindrops began to fall, Boone positioned himself at the living room window with a clear view of the approach road. His emergency medical kit sat open on the table beside him, bandages and antiseptic ready for whatever the night might bring. The waiting had begun. The black SUVs came at 3 in the morning, their headlights cutting through the rain like searchlights. Boone watched them approach through Martha's living room window, counting vehicles and estimating personnel. 3 trucks, probably 6 to 8 men total. Exactly what he'd expected from a professional collection operation. "Positions," he called softly, and the defenders of the Henley farm moved to their predetermined locations with surprising calm. Martha took cover behind the heavy oak table in the dining room, her husband's hunting rifle steady in her experienced hands. Jake positioned himself at the back bedroom window, his father's compass tucked safely in his shirt pocket where it couldn't be lost in the coming chaos. Rex lay quietly beside Martha, his ears alert but his demeanor calm. The dog seemed to understand that his family was in danger, and he was ready to do his part in protecting them. The SUVs stopped just outside the range of the porch light, their engines idling while Torino assessed the situation. Through the rain-streaked glass, Boone could see figures moving in the vehicles, preparing weapons and coordinating their approach. These men were professionals, but they were also overconfident. They expected to be dealing with a frightened old woman and a desperate young man. not a prepared defensive position. Torino's voice carried clearly through the storm when he stepped out of the lead vehicle. "Mrs. Henley, I believe you have something that belongs to me. Send out your nephew, and we can settle this without anyone getting hurt." Martha's response was delivered in a voice that could have cut steel. "Vincent Torino, this is private property, and you're not welcome here. Turn around and leave while you still can. I'm afraid that's not going to happen, ma'am. You see, your nephew owes me money, and I always collect what's owed, one way or another." From his position at the side window, Boone could see two of Torino's men working their way around toward the barn, trying to establish a flanking position. He keyed the radio they'd set up for communication. "Robert, you've got two coming toward your position from the southeast." "I see them," came Kowalski's steady voice. The former Marine had positioned himself in the barn's hayloft with excellent sight lines toward the approach road. "They're trying to get behind us. Take them out if they cross the fence line." Torino tried a different approach, his voice taking on a reasonable tone. "Mrs. Henley, I understand you want to protect your family." "That's admirable. But you're an elderly woman living on a remote farm, and accidents happen to elderly women all the time. Kitchen fires, falls downstairs, heart attacks brought on by stress. Wouldn't you prefer to resolve this peacefully?" The threat was clear and ugly, exactly the kind of intimidation tactic that had worked for Torino countless times before. But Martha Henley had buried two husbands and raised a troubled nephew. She wasn't easily frightened. "Mr. Torino," she called back, "you clearly don't know much about mountain women. We don't scare easy, and we don't back down from bullies. You've got 30 seconds to leave my property before we start shooting." That was the signal Boone had been waiting for. He moved to the front door, his service weapon drawn but held low. "Torino, this is Boone Carver. You've got one chance to walk away from this." "Sheriff Carver!" "I was wondering when you'd speak up." Torino's laugh carried no humor. "I thought we had an understanding about your limitations." "We do. I understand that 10 years ago I failed to protect a little girl. I understand that failure cost an innocent life and destroyed several others. But I also understand that failing once doesn't mean you stop trying. It should, especially when trying gets more people killed." Through the storm, Boone could see Torino's men spreading out, taking positions that would allow them to pour fire into the farmhouse from multiple angles. The flanking team had reached the fence line and was preparing to cross into Kowalski's kill zone. "You're right about one thing," Boone called out. "I'm not the same man I was 10 years ago. I'm older, maybe slower, definitely more cautious, but I'm also done running from my mistakes." He found what he was looking for when he spotted the glint of metal in one of the parked SUVs, Jake's father's dog tags, hanging from the rearview mirror like a trophy. Michael Henley's identification tags, earned through 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan, were being displayed by the men who were threatening his son and sister-in-law. "Jake," Boone called over his shoulder, "your father's dog tags are in the lead vehicle." The effect on Jake was immediate and profound. His father's military identification had been missing since the day Jake pawned his other possessions, and seeing them treated as a trophy by these criminals ignited something in the young man that desperation hadn't been able to touch. "Those belong to my family," Jake shouted through the window, his voice carrying a new note of anger that surprised even Boone. "Come and get them," Torino replied. "All you have to do is walk out here, and we can discuss terms." "The terms are simple," Martha called out, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "You leave my property immediately, or we start shooting." There won't be any further negotiation. The 30 seconds she'd given them expired in a tense silence, broken only by the drumming of rain on the farmhouse roof. Then Torino made his choice. "Light them up," he ordered his men. The first shot shattered the night, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireflies. The gunfire erupted like thunder, shattering windows and splintering the farmhouse's wooden siding. Boone dropped to the floor as bullets whined overhead, plaster raining down from the ceiling where rounds punched through the walls. From the barn came the steady crack of Kowalski's hunting rifle, each shot precise and deliberate. Everyone stay down. Boone shouted over the chaos. Let them waste their ammunition on empty windows. Martha had taken cover behind her heavy dining room table, returning fire through the shattered front window with methodical precision. Her late husband had taught her to shoot when they were newlyweds, and 40 years of hunting mountain game had made her deadly accurate at these ranges. Jake's position at the back bedroom window gave him a clear view of 2 men trying to circle around the house. His father's revolver barked twice, and one of the attackers stumbled, clutching his shoulder. The wounded man's partner dragged him back toward the vehicles, shouting curses into the storm. "Got one!" Jake called out, his voice tight with adrenaline. From her position near the kitchen window, Dr. Sarah Chen methodically fired her pistol at muzzle flashes, her medical training allowing her to remain calm under pressure. She wasn't trying to hit anyone, just provide suppressing fire to keep the attackers from advancing. The firefight settled into a deadly pattern of advance and retreat, with Torino's men probing for weaknesses while the farmhouse defenders held their positions. The storm provided cover for both sides, muffling sounds and reducing visibility to brief glimpses, illuminated by lightning and gunfire. Then Rex changed everything. The dog had been lying quietly beside Martha, but when one of Torino's men managed to reach the porch, Rex exploded into action. 60 pounds of loyal German Shepherd mix launched himself through the broken front window, sinking his teeth into the intruder's gun arm with the ferocity of a wild animal protecting his pack. The man screamed and dropped his weapon, trying desperately to shake off the dog while his teammates poured fire toward the farmhouse. But Rex held on with grim determination, his powerful jaws locked around the gunman's forearm while his weight pulled the man off balance. "Rex!" Martha cried, torn between pride and terror for her beloved companion. Boone saw his opportunity and took it. Rolling through the front door, he came up firing, his service weapon barking 3 times in rapid succession. The first shot took down the man struggling with Rex. The second drove back another attacker who was trying to flank them, and the third shattered the windshield of the nearest SUV. "Fall back!" Torino shouted to his men. "Regroup at the vehicles." But Jake wasn't content to let them retreat and regroup. The sight of his father's dog tags had awakened something in him that years of guilt and self-doubt had suppressed. The memory of what it meant to be Michael Henley's son. "They've got Dad's tags," he said, his voice eerily calm despite the gunfire. "I'm going to get them back." Before anyone could stop him, Jake vaulted through his bedroom window and sprinted toward the parked SUVs. His father's compass clutched in one hand and the revolver in the other. Bullets kicked up dirt around his feet as he zigzagged through the darkness. Using the storm and his knowledge of the terrain to stay ahead of the gunfire, Boone cursed and followed, knowing that Jake was either brave enough or crazy enough to get himself killed, trying to recover a sentimental artifact. But as he watched the young man move with surprising tactical awareness, staying low and using cover effectively, he realized that Jake was neither crazy nor suicidal. He was finally fighting for something that mattered. The lead SUV's engine roared to life as Torino tried to organize a retreat, but Jake reached the vehicle before it could pull away. He smashed the driver's side window with his father's compass, hauling the startled gunman out of the driver's seat and retrieving the dog tags from the rearview mirror. These belonged to Sergeant Michael Henley, United States Army. Jake shouted over the gunfire, holding the tags high. He died fighting for his country, and his son isn't backing down from criminals and cowards. Martha's wedding ring caught the light as she offered it through the farmhouse window, not as payment to Torino, but as a symbol of everything she was willing to sacrifice to protect her family. "Vincent Torino," she called out. "You want something valuable? This ring represents 50 years of love and commitment. Take it and leave my nephew alone." But Torino was beyond negotiation now. His professional reputation was at stake, and retreat would mean admitting defeat to a group of small-town farmers. He raised his own weapon, aiming directly at Jake as the young man stood exposed beside the damaged SUV. The shot echoed across the farmyard like a crack of thunder, and for a moment, time seemed suspended in the mountain air. Then Jake staggered, his father's dog tags clutched against his chest, and Boone knew that once again he might be too late to save someone who had trusted him to keep them safe. But this time, the ending would be different. This time, Boone Carver wasn't running away from his failures. He was running toward them, determined to write a different conclusion to the story that had haunted him for 10 long years. The shot had missed. Jake stood in the rain beside the damaged SUV, his father's dog tags pressed against his chest, while Torino's bullet sparked off the vehicle's hood inches from where he'd been standing. The near miss had been caused by Rex, who had launched himself at Torino just as the loan shark pulled the trigger. Throwing off his aim at the crucial moment, Boone reached Jake's position and pulled the young man to cover behind the SUV. "You hit?" "No, but Rex—" Jake's voice broke as he saw the dog lying motionless near Torino's feet. The loyal German Shepherd mix had taken the bullet meant for Jake, his final act of protection for the family he'd served faithfully his entire life. Even from their concealed position, they could see that Rex wasn't moving. "He saved me," Jake whispered, clutching his father's dog tag so tightly the metal edges cut into his palms. Just like he tried to save everyone else. The gunfire had stopped, leaving only the sound of rain and the idling engines of Torino's remaining vehicles. 2 of his men were wounded, 1 was dead, and the rest were looking nervously toward the approaching lights of the state police vehicles that Tom Murphy had called 20 minutes ago. "This ends now, Torino," Boone called out, his service weapon trained on the loan shark. "Your men are outnumbered, outgunned, and the cavalry's arriving. Take your wounded and go, or spend the rest of your life in a Montana prison." Torino looked around at his decimated crew and the approaching emergency lights. The professional in him recognized a lost cause when he saw one, but his pride wouldn't let him retreat without some kind of victory. "The debt still stands," he shouted back. $15,000 plus interest for my trouble tonight. "This doesn't end until I collect." Martha's voice carried clearly across the farmyard, steady and implacable as mountain stone. "The debt is paid, Mr. Torino, paid in full with the blood of an innocent animal who died protecting his family. Take that to your bosses and tell them what happens to men who threaten the people of Pine Ridge." The state police cars crested the hill with sirens wailing, their spotlight beams cutting through the storm like searchlights. Torino made his final calculation and climbed into the least damaged SUV. "This isn't over," he called out as his remaining men loaded their wounded companions. "Yes, it is," Boone replied quietly, but his words carried clearly through the rain. "And if you ever come back to Montana, if you ever threaten another family in this state, I'll be waiting for you." The black SUVs disappeared into the storm, carrying Vincent Torino and his broken crew back toward whatever city had spawned them. They would not return. Men like Torino understood only strength and consequences, and tonight they had learned that small towns could bite back when pushed too far. 6 months later, spring had come to Pine Ridge with unusual gentleness. The snow melted early, the creek ran clear and cold, and wildflowers bloomed in the meadows where winter had held sway for so long. Boone stood in Martha Henley's kitchen, watching through the window as Jake worked in the garden behind the farmhouse. The young man moved with purpose and confidence, planting rows of vegetables with the same careful attention his uncle had shown years before. The transformation had been gradual but complete. Jake had found work at the lumber mill, stopped drinking, and gradually paid back every penny he owed to local creditors through honest labor. "He's doing better," Martha said, joining Boone at the window. "Better than I dared hope 6 months ago. He's doing what his father would have wanted him to do. Sometimes that's all any of us can manage." On the kitchen table sat a simple leather collar with brass nameplate, reading "Rex, loved and protected." They had buried the loyal dog on the hill behind the farmhouse, beneath an old oak tree, where he could watch over the family he'd died defending. The collar was all that remained, but it carried the weight of complete devotion and sacrifice. Jake had taken to wearing his father's dog tags openly now, no longer ashamed of the legacy they represented. The compass lived on his bedside table, pointing steadily north toward whatever challenges the future might bring. He'd found his direction at last, not through desperate schemes or running away, but by standing and fighting for the people who mattered. Boone had moved back to town, renting a small apartment above Murphy's general store. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it felt right in ways his mountain exile never had. He helped the young sheriff with difficult cases, volunteered at the church, and slowly rebuilt the connections that isolation had severed. Dr. Sarah Chen stopped by his apartment every few days, sometimes for coffee, sometimes just to talk. They never spoke directly about Samantha or the past, but her presence was a kind of forgiveness that Boone was learning to accept. Some wounds never fully healed, but they could stop bleeding if you let them. The red bandana that had started everything still hung on Boone's kitchen wall, a reminder that mercy could change everything if someone was willing to act. It had been torn and stained by its ordeal, but Martha had carefully mended it, and now it served as a symbol of second chances and the power of choosing compassion over convenience. On quiet evenings, Boone would sit on his apartment's small balcony and listen to the sounds of Pine Ridge settling into darkness. Children playing in yards, neighbors calling to each other across fence lines, the distant whistle of freight trains carrying their cargo through the mountain passes. It was the sound of a community that had faced a threat together and emerged stronger for the experience. Sometimes the worst thing about being alone is that nobody hears you when you cry for help. Sometimes the best thing about being alone is that when you do hear someone crying, you know it's your job to answer. Boone Carver had spent 10 years learning the first lesson. It had taken one injured dog and a desperate young man to teach him the second. Now, when the night wind carried the sound of trains through the mountain valleys, he no longer heard the echo of past failures. He heard the promise of tomorrow, and the possibility that there might still be time to save everyone who needed saving.